Adam Taylor lived at 41 Cowleys in the town of Chippenham with his mother, Jen, stepfather, Tony, and brother, Zach. From the outside, their house looked like any other in the neighbourhood, but inside, it was a different story. The Taylors were known for their lack of hygiene and their overwhelming smell, which often drew complaints from the neighbours. Adam was the worst offender, with his dirty clothes and unkempt appearance. He rarely showered and never brushed his teeth, and his hair was always greasy and matted. Despite his mother's efforts to clean the house, it always seemed to be cluttered and dirty, with piles of trash and clutter littering every surface. Adam's brother, Zach, was known for his wild and animalistic behaviour. He often wore dog collars and chains, and he was prone to fits of rage and destruction. Tony, the stepfather, was a biker and a pedophile with a criminal record that included several charges of child molestation. He was often seen around town wearing a leather biker jacket and acting menacingly towards anyone who crossed him. Jen, the mother, was a neglectful and abusive parent. She was more interested in denying the truth. As a result of their family's reputation and their lack of cleanliness, Adam was constantly teased and bullied at school and in the neighbourhood. Kids would hold their noses and make fun of him whenever he walked by, and even the adults seemed to avoid him wherever possible. Adam's family was ostracised because of their odour, and it made life difficult for all of them. Thomas Benfield was a strange young man who lived in the town of Cowan, just a short drive from Chippenham. He was known for his scruffy long hair, his knock-off Converse sneakers, and his jean jacket, which he wore almost everywhere he went. To the average person, Thomas seemed to be gay, but in reality, he was just an odd and eccentric individual who marched to the beat of his own drum. Despite his unusual appearance and personality, Thomas was known for having an unhealthy obsession with weird, ugly fat girls. He would often contact these women, who lived hours away from him, and then start temporary relationships that rarely lasted longer than a couple of months. Thomas prided himself on his failed boxing career, and he often boasted about his supposed prowess in the ring, even though he had never actually won a single match. Thomas was a wimp and a mama's boy, always obedient to his mother's every word and never daring to defy her, even though he was already 18 years old. He worked as a grubby bin man, earning minimum wage, and he was a crybaby who had dropped out of college after a teacher had insulted him. Despite his many flaws, Thomas was best friends with Adam Taylor. Thomas and Adam had gone to Benfield school together, and they had remained close ever since. Adam was the one person who accepted Thomas for who he was, and he didn't judge him for his strange obsessions or his failed boxing career. Together, the two friends enjoyed many adventures and misadventures, and they supported each other through thick and thin. Unfortunately, Thomas' love life was a disaster. He was constantly jumping from one weird, ugly, fat girl to the next, and it was a sad and lonely existence. He longed for someone to love him for who he was, and not just for his jean jacket or his failed boxing career. Despite his many shortcomings, Thomas was a kind and compassionate person at heart. He had a soft spot for the underdogs and the misfits, and he always tried to see the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it. This often led him into trouble, as he was too trusting and too naive, but he always managed to find his way out of any predicament. One day, Thomas and Adam decided to embark on one of their usual adventures. They decided to explore the abandoned sewage treatment plant on the outskirts of town. As they made their way through the dark and damp tunnels, Adam couldn't help but be drawn to the putrid smells that filled the air. He couldn't resist the urge to take a scoop of the muck that covered the ground and smear it on his face, much to Tom's disgust. Despite Tom's protests, Adam insisted on continuing deeper into the plant. As they stumbled upon an old room filled with rusting machinery, Adam's eyes lit up with excitement. He climbed up onto one of the machines and began rummaging through a pile of debris. Suddenly, he pulled out a large, brown lump and triumphantly held it up for Thomas to see.
Look at this, Tom. It's the biggest turd I've ever seen.
Adam exclaimed. Thomas couldn't believe his eyes.
Adam, what the hell are you doing? That's gross. Put it down!
He yelled, but Adam just laughed and continued to play with the lump of feces, flinging it at Thomas and smearing it on the walls. Thomas couldn't take it anymore and ran out of the room, leaving Adam to continue his disgusting playtime. As they made their way back home, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling of disgust and revulsion. He knew he couldn't be friends with someone who found enjoyment in such repulsive behavior. When they arrived back at Adam's house, Thomas told him that he couldn't be friends with him anymore and walked away, leaving Adam standing alone in his front yard with a confused and dejected look on his face. Thomas and Adam's relationship took a turn for the worse after Thomas refused to join Adam on his excursions to explore disgusting places and collect feces. Adam became jealous of Thomas's refusal to join in on his hobbies and decided to seek revenge. One day, while Thomas was walking home from work, he was ambushed by Adam, who had smeared feces all over his face and clothes. Thomas was disgusted and humiliated as Adam cackled with glee at the sight of his friend covered in poop. Feeling embarrassed and betrayed, Thomas confronted Adam about his actions and ended their friendship. Despite his initial sadness at losing his best friend, Thomas realized that it was best for his own mental and physical well-being to distance himself from someone who took pleasure in such unhealthy and disgusting behaviors. From that day on, Thomas made a conscious effort to surround himself with people who respected boundaries and had a sense of personal hygiene. He learned to stand up for himself and not let anyone, even a close friend, treat him with such disrespect. Adam Taylor and Tony had been plotting their revenge on Thomas Benfield for weeks. They were tired of being constantly ridiculed and ostracized because of their unhygienic habits and repulsive odors. They wanted to teach Thomas a lesson and make him pay for all of the insults and humiliations he had inflicted upon them. So one dark and stormy night, Adam and Tony snuck into Thomas's house while he was fast asleep. They tiptoed into his bedroom and stood over his bed, grinning manically as they prepared to enact their twisted plan. Adam reached into his pocket and pulled out a jar of his own feces, which he had been saving for this special occasion. He opened the jar and began smearing the feces all over Thomas's bedspread and pillows, laughing merrily as he did so. Tony, meanwhile, was busy ransacking Thomas's closet, searching for anything of value to steal. He found a few items worth taking and stuffed them into his backpack, cackling gleefully as he did so. As they finished their mischievous deed, Adam and Tony slipped out of the house as quietly as they had come, leaving Thomas to wake up to a revolting and pungent surprise. When Thomas woke up the next morning, he was greeted by a sight that made him sick to his stomach. Adam and Tony had smeared feces all over his bed, walls, and even his beloved jean jacket. They had also left behind a trail of destruction throughout the rest of the house, ransacking and vandalizing as they went. Thomas was livid with anger. How could his best friend betray him like this? And what kind of person would willingly participate in such a disgusting act? He knew he had to take action, determined to seek revenge. Thomas stormed over to the tailor's house at 41 Cowleys. He knocked on the door with such force that it nearly came off its hinges. When Jen, Adam's mother, answered, Thomas didn't even give her a chance to speak before pushing his way past her and into the house. Inside, he was greeted by the sight of Tony lounging on the couch, a satisfied smirk on his face. Adam was nowhere to be found. Before he could say a word, he was overcome by the overpowering stench of feces that permeated the air. As he looked around the room, he realized that the Taylors had decorated their entire house with feces, smearing it on the walls and furniture as some sort of twisted form of revenge. Tom was disgusted and revolted, and he knew that he couldn't stay in that house a moment longer. He stormed out, determined to never speak to the Taylors again and to put this entire incident behind him. As Tom walked through the streets of Calne, his mind was consumed with thoughts of revenge. He couldn't believe that Adam and Tony had invaded his home in the middle of the night and done those unspeakable things to him. He knew he had to do something to get back at them, but he wasn't sure what. Tom's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a motorcycle revving up behind him. He turned to see Tony riding towards him, a sinister grin on his face.
Hey, Tom!
Tony sneered as he came to a stop next to him.
I heard you were looking for revenge. Well, you're not going to find it with me. I'm always one step ahead.
Tom's heart raced as Tony leaned in closer, his hot breath on Tom's face.
But if you really want to get back at me and Adam, there's only one way to do it. Come to our house tonight, and we'll show you what real revenge looks like.
Tom's stomach churned at the thought of going back to the Taylor's house, but he knew he couldn't back down now. He nodded silently and Tony rode off, cackling manically. As the sun began to set, Tom made his way to the Taylor's house, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew he was walking into a trap, but he was determined to get revenge for what they had done to him. When he arrived at the house, Adam and Tony were waiting for him, their faces twisted into snarls. Without a word, they attacked him, pummeling him with their fists until he was lying on the ground, battered and bruised. Tom tried to fight back, but it was no use. Adam and Tony were too strong. Tony's true nature was revealed. He was a predator, lashing out with sadistic glee, enjoying the pain he was causing Tom. And before he knew it, they had tied him up and were dragging him into the basement. There, in the dim light, Tom saw the full extent of the Taylors' depravity. They had set up a makeshift torture chamber, filled with all manner of sickening instruments and devices. As Tony began to carry out his sadistic urges, Tom knew he was doomed. He closed his eyes, praying for the end to come quickly, knowing that he would never be able to escape the clutches of the Taylors and their twisted sense of revenge.
You shouldn't have come here, Tom!
Tony snarled, his eyes wild with excitement.
I've been waiting for this moment for a long time.
And with that, Tony began to torture Tom, using all of the sick and twisted techniques he had learned over the years. Tom screamed and begged for mercy, but Tony only laughed and continued his rampage. As the night wore on, Tom's screams echoed through the empty halls of the Taylor's house, and when dawn finally broke, Tom lay broken and battered on the cold basement floor, wondering if he would ever be able to escape the clutches of the Taylor family. In what seemed like a miracle, Tony left the basement to go and have his way with Adam as he slept, leaving Tom alone on the cold basement floor. As Tom lay bound and helpless on the floor, he knew he had to escape. With one final burst of adrenaline, Tom was able to break free from his restraints and ran out of the Taylor's door as fast as possible and back to safety, forever scarred from what Tony has done to him. As Tom sat at home, nursing his wounds and trying to recover from the traumatic events that had occurred at the hands of Tony and the Taylor family. He couldn't shake the feeling of anger and determination that burned inside of him. He knew that he couldn't let them get away with what they had done to him, and he was determined to get his revenge. For weeks, Tom spent every waking moment researching and planning his next move. He studied maps of the sewers under Chipham, trying to locate the Taylor's hideout. He practiced self-defense techniques, determined to be ready for whatever might come his way, and he gathered all the supplies he would need for his journey into the dark, wet, and dangerous underground tunnels. Finally, the day of his mission arrived. Tom donned his old, worn jean jacket and slipped on his trusty knockoff Converse sneakers. He took a deep breath and stepped out into the rain, determined to face whatever lay ahead. As he made his way through the streets of Chipham, Tom couldn't help but feel a sense of dread creeping over him. He knew that the Taylors were dangerous and ruthless, and he knew that they would stop at nothing to protect their hideout. But he was determined to see this through, no matter what the cost. At last, Tom reached the entrance to the sewers. He hesitated for a moment, knowing that he was about to embark on a journey that would test his strength and bravery to the limit. But he knew that he had to do this for his own peace of mind and for the sake of justice. With a deep breath, Tom stepped into the dark, wet tunnels and began his journey towards the Taylor's hideout. He moved cautiously, using his flashlight to navigate through the twisting, turning passageways. He could hear the sounds of rats scurrying around him and the water dripping from the ceiling. It was a cold, gloomy place, and Tom couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Tom knew he had to be cautious. He had learned his lesson the last time he had confronted them, and knew that they were dangerous and unpredictable. He packed a bag full of supplies, including a flashlight, a map of the sewers, and a can of pepper spray, just in case. Tom was determined to find the Taylor's hideout and bring them to justice. He followed the map, carefully navigating the dark and damp tunnels of the sewer system. The stench was almost unbearable, but Tom pressed on, driven by his desire for revenge. As he searched, he could hear the faint sounds of rats scurrying in the shadows. He tried to stay quiet, not wanting to alert the Taylors to his presence. But as he turned the corner, he was suddenly confronted by a group of the dirty and malnourished creatures, hissing and snarling at him. Tom quickly pulled out his pepper spray and sprayed it in their direction, causing the rats to scatter. He took the opportunity to continue on his search, his heart racing as he wondered what other dangers lay ahead. As Tom made his way through the dark and damp sewers, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He had heard rumors about the Taylor family taking up residence in the underground tunnels, and he knew that he needed to be on high alert. He had come prepared, but he still couldn't shake the feeling of dread that seemed to hang in the air. As he turned a corner, he saw a faint light up ahead and knew he was getting closer to the Taylor's hideout. He heard a rustling noise and their voice.
Who's there?
It was Adam, Tom's former friend.
It's me, Tom!
Tom called out, trying to sound as confident as possible.
Tom, what are you doing here?
Adam asked, as he approached Tom with a flashlight of his own.
I'm here to talk to Tony.
Tom said, trying to keep his voice steady.
I need to settle this once and for all.
Adam nodded and led Tom deeper into the tunnels until they reached a small, makeshift campsite where the rest of the Taylor family was huddled around a small fire. Tony looked up as Tom approached, and his eyes narrowed.
What do you want, Tom?
Tony growled.
I just want to talk.
Tom said, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice. Tony sneered and stood up, towering over Tom.
I don't have time for this.
He said, reaching for his belt. Tom's instincts kicked in and he sprayed Tony with the pepper spray, causing him to stumble and fall to the ground, coughing and choking. Tom turned to Adam. Adam gestured for Tom to run. As Tom darted down the tunnels and ran for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Tom saw daylight. Tom stopped out of breath before climbing out of the sewers. But even as he was savoring his victory, Tom knew that the tailors would never truly be gone. They were a cancer, infecting everything they touched and spreading their hatred and venom wherever they went. Tom left the tailors there in the sewers, bleeding and broken, and walked away knowing that they would be back for him one day. Suddenly, Tom heard the sound of Tony unzipping his flies, and the sound of his footsteps approaching quickly. Panicked, Tom turned and tried to run, but it was too late. Tony grabbed him by the collar and dragged him deeper into the sewers. Adam cackled as he watched his stepfather manhandle Tom.
Silly Tom, you should know better than to trust a tailor.
Adam said with a sneer. The tailors took Tom to their makeshift home in the sewers and began to subject him to all sorts of foul treatment. They laughed and jeered as they took turns tormenting him, relishing in the power they held over him. Tom knew he was no match for the tailors and their sick pleasures. He was trapped in the sewers, at the mercy of these depraved individuals. He closed his eyes and tried to block out the sounds of their laughter and the pain they inflicted upon him. As Tom was dragged deeper into the sewers by Tony and Adam, he knew he was in trouble. He struggled and fought against their grit, but they were too strong. Eventually, they reached a small, damp chamber where Adam and Tony lived amongst the rats and filth. Tom knew he had to think of a way out. He couldn't fight against both Adam and Tony, especially with Tony's pedophilic tendencies. He needed a weapon, something to defend himself with. He scanned the room and spotted a small, broken pipeline on the ground. Without hesitation, he grabbed it and swung it at Adam, catching him off guard and knocking him to the ground. Tony, however, was not so easily defeated. He grabbed Tom by the throat and squeezed, trying to strangle him. Tom fought back, but he knew he couldn't keep it up for long. Just when he thought all hope was lost, Tom was able to slide out from between Tony's legs, using the human waste sewage as a lubricant. Tom ran down the dark tunnel ahead, the only direction he could.
You shouldn't have come back here. Tom!
Tony echoed from behind, his voice dripping with malice. Tom's heart raced as he crept through the dark, damp tunnel. He could hear the tailor's footsteps getting louder and louder, and he knew he had to find a place to hide. Finally, he spotted a small alcove filled with debris and trash. He quickly climbed in and buried himself under the pile, hoping the tailors would pass by without noticing him. For what felt like an eternity, Tom lay there, listening to the footsteps and voices of Adam, Jen, Tony, and Zach as they walked past. Finally, they grew faint and he knew it was safe to emerge. Cautiously, he made his way down the tunnel, following the sound of Adam's distinctive voice. He knew he was taking a risk by going after the tailors, but he couldn't let them get away with what they had done to him. As he approached their makeshift camp, Tom could smell the stench of sewage and decay. He peered through a small opening and saw the tailors sitting around a small fire, laughing and chatting. He could see the mattress they slept on, covered in white and brown stains, and various disgusting trinkets and supplies scattered around the area. Tom's stomach turned at the sight, and he knew he had to get out of there as soon as possible. He backed away quietly, hoping to sneak out unnoticed, but as he turned to leave, he felt a hand grab his shoulder.
Going somewhere? Tom?
It was Tony. Tony chuckled, a sinister glint in his eye.
I think it's time for you to join us down here in the sewers permanently.
Tom struggled to break free, but Tony was too strong. Tom was dragged back into the sewers, his cries for help falling on deaf ears. The Taylor family was waiting for him, ready to inflict their twisted form of revenge. As he was thrown into their midst, Tom knew he was in for a long, dark night.
Welcome to your new home, Tom.
Adam said, gesturing to the rat-infested mattress.
We'll make sure you never want to leave.
As Tom stood in the Taylor's makeshift camp in the sewer, he couldn't believe the horrors that were being inflicted upon him. Tony and Adam had taken him back to their home, deep in the tunnels beneath Chipham, and had told him that his name was now Tommy Taylor. Tom was terrified, knowing that he would never be able to escape this twisted family. Adam cackled manically as he handed Tom a bucket of feces, saying,
Welcome to the family, Tommy. You have to earn your place with us, and the first thing you have to do is paint these walls with your new family's favorite color.
Tom looked at the bucket in disgust, but he knew that he had no choice. He grabbed a paintbrush and started to cover the walls in the brown sludge, trying not to retch at the sickening stench. As he worked, Tony and Adam watched with glee, cheering him on as he completed the disgusting task. When Tom was finished, Tony clapped him on the back and declared,
Welcome to the Taylor family. Tommy, you're one of us now.
Tom knew that he would never be able to escape the Taylors, and he resigned himself to a life of disgust and depravity, trapped in the sewers with this twisted family. The Taylors continued to commit disgusting acts, and Tom was powerless to stop them. He knew that he would be trapped in this hellish existence for the rest of his life. Tommy Taylor, as he was now known, was taken deeper into the sewers by the Taylor family. He was forced to participate in a series of disgusting and degrading tasks in order to prove his loyalty to the family. He was made to eat moldy food, drink dirty water, and do things he never thought he was capable of. The Taylors were a twisted group, and they took pleasure in Tom's suffering. They laughed as he gagged on rotten food and cheered when he managed to complete a particularly revolting task. As the days passed, Tom began to lose his sense of self. He was no longer Thomas Benfield, the wimpy Benan from Cowan. He was now Tommy Taylor, a member of the Taylor family, and he was expected to do whatever was asked of him, no matter how disgusting or degrading it was. Despite his efforts to resist, Tom found himself becoming more and more enmeshed in the twisted world of the Taylors. He became numb to the horrors around him and began to take pleasure in the suffering of others. As the months passed, Tom lost all sense of right and wrong. He became a monster, just like the Taylors, and he reveled in it. The Taylor family had won, and Tom was lost forever. As the days went by, Tom was subjected to more and more disgusting tasks and initiations by the Taylor family. They seemed to take pleasure in coming up with new and increasingly depraved ways to break him down and make him one of their own. One of the tasks that particularly stands out in Tom's memory is the one that involved him going into the sewer maintenance room alone with Tony. As he walked into the dimly lit room, Tom's heart pounded in his chest. He knew that Tony had a reputation as a predator, and he was terrified of what the man might do to him. Despite his fear, Tom forced himself to keep walking, his feet leading him deeper and deeper into the room. Finally, he found himself standing in front of Tony, who leered at him with a twisted smile on his face.
So, you're ready to become one of us, huh?
Tony said, his voice dripping with malice.
Well, there's just one more thing you need to do.
Tom didn't like the sound of that at all, but he knew he had no choice but to go along with whatever Tony had planned. So, he stood there and watched as the man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small vial filled with a clear liquid.
Drink this!
Tony said, holding out the vial to Tom.
It's a special potion that will help you embrace your new identity as a tailor.
Tom hesitated for a moment, but then he realized that he had no other options. So, he took the vial and drank the contents, hoping that it wouldn't be too terrible. To his surprise, the potion actually tasted quite sweet, and he found himself feeling a strange sense of calm wash over him. As the minutes ticked by, Tom's body began to feel hay, and he realized that he was starting to lose consciousness. The last thing he saw before he blacked out was Tony's twisted grin, and then everything went dark. When Tom woke up, he found himself in a bed, with Tony standing over him, a satisfied look on his face.
Welcome to the family, Tommy,
Tony said, patting Tom on the head.
You're one of us now, and there's no turning back.
Tom knew that Tony was right. He was trapped in this hellhole with the Taylor family, and there was no way he was ever going to escape. So, he resigned himself to his fate and tried to make the best of it, all the while hoping that one day he would find a way out of this nightmare. As the Taylor family dragged Tommy through the dark, damn sewers, he couldn't help but feel a sense of dread wash over him. He had been with them for what felt like an eternity, and every day brought with it new horrors and depravities that he never could have imagined. But today, it seemed, was going to be particularly bad. Adam had a wild gleam in his eye, and Tony was practically drooling at the thought of whatever sick adventure they had planned. They led Tommy through a series of twists and turns, finally coming to a stop in front of a rusted metal door. Tony fumbled with a set of keys, finally managing to unlock it and push it open with a loud, creaky groan. As they stepped inside, the smell hit Tommy like a wall. It was a mixture of decay and human waste, and he had to fight the urge to gag. The room was small and cramped, with pipes and wires running along the walls and ceiling. And in the corner, huddled under a dirty blanket, was a figure. As they approached, the figure let out a low moan, and Tommy could see that it was a young boy, his face gaunt and covered in bruises. Adam and Tony exchanged a grin, and Tommy's stomach turned as he realized what was about to happen. For the next few hours, Tommy was forced to watch as the Taylors took turns abusing and tormenting the boy, using him for their own twisted pleasure. And as he stood there, helpless and horrified, he knew that he was trapped in this hellhole forever, doomed to a life of depravity and degradation. As the Taylors faced their latest disgusting adventure, they returned to their makeshift camp in the sewers beneath Chipham. Tommy, now fully emaciated into the Taylor family, was covered in filth and bruises from the tasks he had been forced to complete.
Well done, Tommy.
Adam grinned, clapping him on the back.
You're a true tailor now.
Tommy couldn't believe what he had become. Just a few weeks ago, he was a normal teenager living in Cairn, working a mundane job as a binman. Now, he was a part of the Taylor family, a group of sick and twisted individuals who took pleasure in committing disgusting acts and living in the sewers. As the Taylors sat around their campfire, drinking cheap, stolen beer, Tony stood up and announced their next adventure.
Tomorrow, we're gonna pay a little visit to the nursery,
He said with a sinister grin.
I've been feeling a little peckish lately.
Tommy's stomach turned at the thought of what Tony was planning to do. He knew that he couldn't let this happen, but he was also terrified of the consequences of going against the tailors. As the night wore on, Tommy couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in his gut. As Tommy walked back towards the tailors' makeshift camp in the sewers, he couldn't shake the feeling of disgust and revulsion that had taken over him. He knew that he had been changed by the tailors, consumed by the darkness that they had bestowed upon his soul, but at the same time, he also knew that he couldn't resist their twisted pull. They were his family now, for better or for worse. And so, with a heavy heart, he followed them on their next disgusting adventure. This time, they were exploring the abandoned subway tunnels beneath the town. As they walked through the dark, down tunnels, Tony and Adam gleefully regaled Tommy with stories of the horrors that they had encountered on previous trips down there. But it was when they reached a particularly decrepit section of the tunnels that things took a turn for the worst. As they walked, they heard the faint sound of crying coming from one of the side tunnels. Without hesitation, Tony and Adam charged towards the sound, with Tommy following close behind. As they turned the corner, they were confronted with a shocking sight. There, huddled in the corner, was a small group of homeless children, covered in filth and shivering with fear. Tony and Adam's eyes lit up with excitement as they approached the children, their predatory instincts taking over. Tommy watched in horror as the tailors set upon the children, dragging them away into the darkness of the tunnels. And as he followed them, he knew that he would never be able to escape the darkness that had consumed him. Tommy had been living with the Taylor family in the sewers for what felt like an eternity. At first, he had been terrified, not knowing what to expect from the strange group of people who had taken him in. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, Tommy began to become accustomed to life in the sewers. The Taylors had their own way of doing things, and they expected Tommy to follow their rules. They spent their days scavenging for food and supplies in the tunnels, and Tommy quickly learned how to navigate the dark and cramped spaces. At night, they would huddle around a small fire, listening to Tony's stories of his biker days and Jen's tales of her wild youth. Adam was always eager to please his family, and he would often bring back strange and disturbing souvenirs from his adventures in the tunnels. Despite the gross and often dangerous conditions, Tommy found himself feeling oddly at home with the Taylors. They were his only family now, and he knew that he had to do whatever it took to earn their respect and loyalty. As the months turned into years, Tommy became more and more entrenched in the Taylors' way of life. He learned how to fight and defend himself, and he even began to take part in some of their more nefarious activities. Despite the dangers and the disgust he often felt, Tommy couldn't help but feel a sense of belonging with the Taylors. They were his family, and he knew that he would do anything to protect them and the life they had built together in the sewers. As Tommy trudged through the dark, down tunnels of the sewer, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease wash over him. He had been with the Taylor family for months now, and while he had grown accustomed to their strange and often disturbing habits, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was not right. Tony, the family's patriarch and leader, a wild beam in his eye as he led the way through the tunnels, a sharp knife clutched tightly in his hand. Adam, Tony's son, followed closely behind, a wicked grin plastered across his face. Tommy knew that they were up to no good, and he couldn't help but wonder what kind of sick and twisted adventure they were embarking on this time. He had lost count of how many bodies they had disposed of in these very same tunnels, and he didn't want to think about what else they had done down here. As they turned a corner, Tony came to a stop, holding up a hand to signal for the others to do the same. He sniffed the air, a look of excitement on his face, There it is, he hissed, gesturing towards a small opening in the wall. The perfect spot for our next victim. As the Taylor family descended further into the sewers, they became more and more depraved. They had become obsessed with finding new and creative ways to satisfy their twisted desires. One day, Adam had a particularly sick idea. He had heard about a group of homeless people who had taken up residence in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Adam convinced the rest of the family to join him in a little hunting expedition. As they approached the warehouse, they could hear the faint sounds of people talking and laughing. Adam signaled for the others to be quiet, and they sneaked up to the entrance. The Taylor family burst into the warehouse, surprising the homeless people. Tony and Adam quickly overpowered them, while Jennifer and Zach searched the place for anything of value. The homeless people begged for mercy, but the Taylors were beyond reasoning. They tied them up and began torturing them, laughing as they inflicted pain and suffering. As the night went on, the Taylors became more and more frenzied. They mutilated and dismembered the homeless people and eventually started cannibalizing their bodies. Tommy watched in horror as his family indulged in the grotesque feast. He knew that he could never leave them, that he was trapped in the sewers forever, a part of their sick and twisted world.